Humberto Leal was sentenced to die for his role in the 1994 rape and murder of 16-year-old Adria Sauceda. But the Obama administration has joined with the Mexican government to raise concerns that after Leal was arrested, he was never informed of his right to request help from Mexican consular officials.
After spending 16 years on death row, Humberto Leal García met his fate in Texas. His name became tied not only to a brutal crime, but also to an international controversy that challenged treaties, courts, and governments. It was 1994 when a teenage girl was found dead in an empty lot on the outskirts of San Antonio. What followed was a swift investigation, a trial marked by diplomatic tension, and an ending that would pit the state of Texas against much of the world. What began as a party ended as a warning. Justice and the law do not always speak the same language.
It was Saturday, May 21st, 1994. While the Houston Rockets defeated the Phoenix Suns in Game 7 of the NBA playoffs and the Western film Maverick topped the box office, San Antonio moved at the rhythm of its warm southern night. In the working-class neighborhoods of the South, where small houses lined dusty streets lit by flickering lamps, the night smelled of beer and gasoline. On Vincent Street, dozens of young people had gathered for a party without many rules, surrounded by loud music, cheap liquor, and an early taste of summer. Among them was 16-year-old Adria Sauceda, dark-haired and shy-smiled, just hoping to spend a carefree evening with friends. As the night wore on, Adria began to feel sick. Some saw her stumbling behind the house, disoriented and confused. A few said she had drunk too much. Others thought she seemed unwell. Amid the noise and laughter, a man watched her from the doorway. She needed help getting home, and it was Humberto Leal García who offered to drive her. The last time anyone saw Adria, she was getting into Leal's car, half-supported, barely able to stand. There were no arguments, no screams, only the sight of a car disappearing down an empty street. No one imagined that the offer of a ride would become the start of a nightmare. Leal did not take her home. He drove toward a desolate area near the railroad tracks, a place with no lights and no witnesses. There, in the still darkness, he pulled her out of the car. Without saying a word, he picked up a chunk of asphalt heavy as a brick and struck her with brutal force. The blows were concentrated on her head. Adria tried to fight back but had no chance. Her hands would later reveal the scratches and defensive wounds of a desperate struggle. When she fell to the ground, dazed and helpless, he continued. He sexually assaulted her with a wooden stick nearly 12 inches long, causing catastrophic internal injuries. He bit her neck and chest, leaving marks the autopsy would later confirm. When he was done, he left her naked, lying on the ground, bleeding and barely alive. The piece of asphalt he had used as a weapon remained beside her body, stained with blood. Leal returned to his car, started the engine, and drove away, leaving the young girl dying in that lonely field under the still Texas sky. The night went on in silence. Insects buzzed. A train passed in the distance. The city slept. Adria Sauceda lay motionless beneath the vast Texas sky, and no one yet knew she was gone. The next morning, the Texas sun beat down on a barren lot on the edge of the neighborhood. A worker passing through noticed something in the weeds and stopped. When he approached, he discovered the body of a young woman and immediately called the police. When the officers arrived, the scene left them speechless. The naked body of Adria Sauceda lay covered in dust and blood, stretched among rocks and dry soil. There were unmistakable signs of sexual assault, multiple blows to the face, and a fatal wound to the head caused by a chunk of asphalt found nearby. The silence of the place clashed with the violence that had unfolded there. Investigators cordoned off the area, photographed every detail, and began collecting evidence. The marks on the ground showed that she had been dragged. A torn piece of shirt, an oil stain, and tire tracks leading toward the road formed the first trail to follow. Detectives from the San Antonio Police Department canvassed the neighborhood and spoke with those who had been at the party. Every account pointed to the same name, Humberto Leal García. Hours later, officers located him and brought him in for questioning. Leal tried to remain calm. He admitted attending the party and seeing Adria, but denied taking her with him. His story shifted several times in a matter of hours. Eventually, he admitted driving her, but claimed she had gotten out of the car on her own, stumbled, and fallen. He said he panicked and left, trying to paint the picture of a tragic accident. The investigators did not believe him. His behavior was erratic, swinging from calm to confusion, from denial to partial admission. In one statement, he acknowledged having pushed her and seen her fall. The forensic evidence spoke for itself. The fibers, hairs, and traces of oil found on the victim matched those from his vehicle. His clothing bore blood and human tissue, and inside the car, investigators discovered a stain consistent with the victim's blood type. There was no turning back. Humberto Leal García was born on January 16, 1973, in Mexico. He came to the United States as a child when his family crossed the border searching for a better life. He grew up in San Antonio, Texas, in a working-class home. He spoke both English and Spanish fluently, went to school like any other kid in the neighborhood, and his childhood showed no signs of extreme violence or abuse. By the age of 21, he was living alone, unemployed, drifting from one odd job to another. Court records do not list a formal occupation at the time of the crime. He was known in the neighborhood but did not have close friends. Some described him as quiet, others as someone who drank too much at parties. There had been no previous reports of sexual violence or aggression. But on that night in May, something inside him broke loose. There was no prior connection between Leal and Adria Sauceda. They were not neighbors, not friends, not even acquaintances. She was simply a vulnerable teenager who trusted him to take her home. That trust became her death sentence. Psychologists who later examined him found no signs of a serial killer or a calculated predator. He was simply a young man under the influence of alcohol, faced with a defenseless victim who crossed every moral line. The violence had been savage, uncontrolled, almost animal. One night, one decision, and a life destroyed forever. Leal's trial took place in Bezar County, Texas, in July of 1995. The prosecution presented a devastating case. The physical evidence was irrefutable. DNA, fibers, bite marks, defensive wounds, and witness testimony from those who saw him leave the party with Adria. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Humberto Leal had kidnapped, raped, and murdered a 16-year-old girl. Prosecutors argued that the crime met every condition required for the death penalty. There were 3 aggravating factors: kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder, committed in a single brutal sequence. The violence had been extreme. Adria never had a chance to escape. She was beaten to death with a piece of asphalt, sexually assaulted with an object, and left to die alone in a vacant lot. The prosecution asked for the death penalty. The defense tried to portray Leal as a man who acted under the influence of alcohol, not out of premeditation. They argued that he had no violent history and never intended to kill. But none of those arguments diminished the brutality of his actions. The forensic experts were clear. Adria's injuries were the result of uncontrollable rage, a violence that did not stop until she was dead. The jury did not take long to deliberate. In July 1995, they found him guilty of capital murder. Weeks later, during the sentencing phase, the same jury decided that Leal should die for what he had done. The judge affirmed their verdict. Humberto Leal García was sentenced to death. The courtroom fell silent. Adria's family wept, some out of anger, others out of relief. Leal showed no emotion. He was escorted back to his cell, where he would wait for years for his sentence to be carried out. The outcome was sealed. Over the next 16 years, Leal filed multiple appeals. All were denied. His lawyers argued procedural errors, ineffective defense, and flaws in the handling of evidence. In 1998, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the conviction. In 1999, the United States Supreme Court declined to review the case. Years later, the defense introduced a new argument. Leal was a Mexican citizen, and at the time of his arrest, the San Antonio police failed to inform him of his right to contact the Mexican consulate, as required under Article 36 of the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. That omission became the center of an international legal battle. In 2004, the International Court of Justice in The Hague ruled in Havana and other Mexican nationals that the United States had violated the Vienna Convention in several cases, including Leal's. The court ordered those cases to be reviewed. But in 2008, in Medellin versus Texas, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the ICJ's decisions were not self-executing without an act of Congress. In 2011, as Leal's execution date approached, his lawyers petitioned the Supreme Court to delay the process until Congress could pass such legislation. In a 5-4 decision, the court denied the request. Justices Breyer, Ginsburg, Sotomayor, and Kagan dissented, arguing that the violation of international law was serious and needed to be corrected. The majority held that there was no legal basis to halt the execution. The government of Mexico issued a formal protest. Amnesty International appealed for clemency. The United Nations expressed concern. Nothing worked. The order of execution remained in place. On July 7, 2011, Humberto Leal García was transferred to the Huntsville unit in Texas, where state executions are carried out. He had spent 16 years on death row. During that time, he wrote letters, spoke with priests, and waited while the world debated his fate. But that afternoon, the debate was over. In his final hours, he declined the customary last meal. He ate the regular prison dinner served on a tray. No family members visited. Only his attorney and a priest were present. When the moment came, he was led into the execution chamber. He was strapped to the gurney, his arms and legs secured with leather restraints and IV lines inserted. Witnesses, Adria Sauceda's relatives, journalists, and officials, watched from behind a glass pane. He was given a chance to speak his last words. Leal spoke softly, in a mix of Texas English and the Spanish of his childhood. He apologized. He said he regretted the pain he had caused, and at the end, in a gesture that would echo around the world, he raised his voice slightly and said, "Viva Mexico." At 6:21 p.m., the lethal chemicals began to flow. First, pentobarbital, which put him to sleep, then pancuronium, which paralyzed his muscles, and finally potassium chloride, which stopped his heart. At 6:35 p.m., Humberto Leal García was pronounced dead. Adria's family left the prison in silence. Some wept, others walked with their eyes fixed on the ground. Outside, a small group of protesters held candles, calling for an end to the death penalty. The international controversy did not end with his death, but for Humberto Leal García, everything was over.
The case of Humberto Leal García reveals what happens when a crime crosses borders and justice becomes a battleground between nations. A young woman lost her life in an act of unbearable violence, and 16 years later, the execution of her killer reopened another wound, the wound of international law ignored. Texas carried out its sentence, but the world remained divided between law and conscience. What began as a night of celebration became a symbol of the price of indifference. Because when justice turns political, silence becomes the real culprit. Do you believe justice was served? Leave your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and watch more stories like this. This was Final Sentence.